The blow came without warning. One moment, Michelle was balancing a tray of crystal goblets, her head bowed as she navigated through the sea of powerful wolves gathered in the Ironclaw Pack's ceremonial hall. The next, she was airborne, her body launched across the polished marble floor by a boot to her ribs that drove the air from her lungs and sent the tray crashing in an explosion of shattered glass. Pain bloomed white-hot across her side. Old fears bloomed faster. She knew that boot. She knew the scent of cedarwood and arrogance that came with it. Even before she heard his voice, cold, mocking, dripping with the same cruelty that had haunted her nightmares for 3 years, she knew exactly who had struck her. "Still crawling on your belly like the worthless thing you are," Stephen Thornridge sneered, his voice carrying across the suddenly silent hall. "Some things never change." Michelle's hands trembled as she pressed them against the floor, shards of glass biting into her palms. Blood welled up, warm and red, but she barely felt it. Physical pain was nothing compared to the agony of memory that Stephen's presence dragged up from the depths where she tried to bury it. 3 years ago, she had knelt before this same man and begged for mercy. She had been 5 months pregnant, her belly round with his child, her human body weak and vulnerable in a world of supernatural strength. She had begged him not to throw her out. Begged him to acknowledge their baby. Begged him to remember the promises he'd whispered when they were alone, when he'd claimed to love her despite her lack of wolf blood. He had laughed in her face. Called her delusional. Called their child a mistake, a stain on his pure bloodline. And then he'd had her dragged to the pack borders and thrown into the wilderness like garbage, with nothing but the clothes on her back and a heart shattered into so many pieces she wondered if it would ever beat properly again. She'd lost the baby 2 weeks later. Alone. Cold. Bleeding out her hope onto forest soil while Stephen celebrated his engagement to a she-wolf with the right pedigree, the right connections, the right everything that Michelle would never be. That loss had nearly killed her. Should have killed her, really. But somehow, she'd survived. "Get up," Stephen commanded now, his polished leather shoe, the same one that had just struck her, tapping impatiently against the marble. "You're making a scene. Clean up this mess and get out of my sight before I have you thrown out again. Though I have to say, I'm almost impressed. I didn't think you'd have the audacity to show your face in civilized wolf society after the disgrace you brought on yourself." Around them, the gathered wolves watched with varying expressions of disgust, pity, and cruel amusement. This was the Ironclaw Pack's annual summit, a gathering of the most powerful packs in the Northern Territories, where alliances were forged and hierarchies were reinforced. It was a place of silk gowns and custom suits, of ancient bloodlines and political maneuvering. Michelle didn't belong here. Everyone could see that. Her servant's uniform was plain and ill-fitting, borrowed from the hosting pack staff. Her hair, once long and lustrous, was now cut short and practical. Her frame was too thin, her posture too hunched, her entire presence radiating the kind of brokenness that made powerful wolves uncomfortable. She was a reminder of what happened to the weak. A cautionary tale in human form. What none of them knew, what Stephen certainly didn't know as he stood over her with that familiar sneer of contempt, was that Michelle's story hadn't ended in that forest 3 years ago. It had been rewritten. As she slowly pushed herself to her knees, her left hand pressed against her wounded ribs, something caught the light. A flash of silver against her pale skin. A ring, simple, elegant, ancient, that she'd been careful to keep turned inward on her finger, hidden from casual observation. But the impact of Stephen's kick had twisted it around. And in the Ironclaw Pack's grand hall, under the light of 100 crystal chandeliers, that ring began to emit a very faint, almost imperceptible glow. The kind of glow that only came from one source in the entire supernatural world. Royal bonding magic. At the far end of the hall, seated on a raised platform among the visiting dignitaries, a figure went utterly still. His glass of wine paused halfway to his lips. His silver eyes, the distinctive mark of ancient alpha bloodlines, locked onto the woman on the floor with an intensity that made the air itself seem to thicken. Slowly, very slowly, Alpha King Derek Silvercrest set down his glass. The sound of crystal meeting wood was soft. Barely audible. But somehow, in that moment, it felt like thunder. The pain in Michelle's ribs was familiar, a sharp, burning reminder that her body remembered trauma even when her mind tried to forget. But it was nothing compared to the shame that crawled up her spine as she felt dozens of eyes on her, judging, dismissing, finding her unworthy of even basic dignity. This was supposed to be a simple job. 3 days of serving at the summit, keeping her head down, earning enough to pay for the tiny room she rented above a bakery in the neutral city of Ashbourne. 3 days, and then she'd disappear back into the shadows where abandoned, broken humans belonged. She should have known better than to think she could move through Stephen's world unnoticed. "I said get up," Stephen repeated, his voice sharp with the authority of a beta wolf who'd never been denied anything in his privileged life. He was handsome in that cold, aristocratic way, sharp jawline, perfectly styled dark hair, expensive suit that probably cost more than Michelle had earned in the entire past year. The same face she'd once thought she loved. The same eyes that had looked at her with warmth before they'd filled with disgust. Beside him, a woman laughed, high and crystalline. Sandra Ravenmore, Stephen's wife of 2 years, was everything Michelle wasn't. Tall, elegant, her wolf blood evident in the preternatural grace of her movements and the faint shimmer of power that clung to her skin. She looked at Michelle the way someone might look at a bug they were deciding whether to crush. "Oh, Stephen, is this her?" Sandra purred, linking her arm through her husband's. "The little human you told me about. The one who tried to trap you with a pregnancy." She tilted her head, studying Michelle with mock sympathy. "You poor, delusional thing. Did you really think a beta wolf from the Thornridge line would tie himself to someone with no pack, no power, no worth?" Each word was a carefully placed knife, designed to cut deep. And they did. But Michelle had learned something crucial in the 3 years since Stephen had destroyed her: pain could be endured if you had something worth enduring it for. And she did. She had a reason to keep breathing, keep fighting, keep surviving, even if that reason was complicated in ways she couldn't fully explain. She reached for the fallen tray with trembling hands, trying to gather the shattered glass, trying to make herself smaller, invisible, forgotten. The role she'd perfected. The armor she wore. "Leave it," a new voice cut through the tension, female, authoritative, with the distinct accent of the Ironclaw Pack's northern territory. A woman in servant's livery, older and stern-faced, pushed through the crowd. "Girl, get yourself to the servants' quarters and have those cuts tended. Now." It was a dismissal, but also a mercy. Michelle nodded gratefully, rising on unsteady legs. Her ribs screamed in protest, probably bruised, possibly cracked, but she'd learned to function through worse. She'd survived a miscarriage alone in the wilderness. She'd survived starvation, exposure, and the kind of despair that made death seem like a kindness. She could survive this. As she turned to leave, head still bowed, she felt it. That strange warmth that had become familiar over the past 8 months. The sensation of being watched, not with contempt or pity, but with something else entirely. Something that made her pulse quicken and her carefully constructed walls threaten to crumble. She didn't look up. Couldn't look up. Not here. Not now. Not when he'd specifically told her to stay hidden, stay safe, stay away from gatherings exactly like this one where his enemies circled and his allies plotted. He'd married her in secret for a reason. Protected her identity for a reason. And that reason was standing somewhere in this hall, watching, waiting, his alpha instincts probably roaring at him to intervene. But intervention would expose her. Would put a target on her back bigger than anything Stephen could create. So Michelle did what she'd promised Derek she would do. She kept her head down and walked away. Behind her, Stephen's voice carried, already dismissing her existence. Pathetic. I can't believe I ever touched something so beneath me. The things we do in our foolish youth, right, darling? Sandra's tinkling laugh followed Michelle out of the hall. But so did something else. A presence. A shadow. And in the corridor outside, away from the crowd's prying eyes, that shadow materialized into solid form, a man who moved with the fluid grace of a predator, his silver eyes now burning with barely contained rage. Alpha King Derek Silvercrest was not a man who lost control. He'd ruled the Northern Territories for 15 years through strategy, strength, and an iron will that had crushed rebellions and forged alliances that reshaped the supernatural world. But watching Stephen Thornridge kick his mate, his wife, in front of a hall full of witnesses had tested that control in ways few things ever had. Michelle, he breathed, his voice rough with emotion as he caught her arm gently, turning her to face him. She looked up at him, this impossibly powerful man who'd found her dying in that forest 3 years ago, who'd saved her life, who'd somehow fallen in love with the broken human girl no one else wanted. His face was a study in contrasts, the sharp, regal features of ancient alpha bloodlines softened by genuine concern, fury warring with tenderness in those quicksilver eyes. I'm fine, she whispered, the lie automatic. You're bleeding, he countered, his thumb brushing over her cut palm with devastating gentleness. And your ribs are bruised. Not broken. I've had worse. The reminder of what she'd survived, what had been done to her before he found her, made his jaw tighten. He doesn't know who you are. No, Michelle agreed softly. And he can't know. Not yet. You said. I know what I said. Derek's free hand cupped her face, his touch achingly careful, as if she were something precious that might shatter. But seeing him hurt you, humiliate you, while I sat there pretending not to know you. His eyes closed briefly, pain flickering across his features. It took everything in me not to rip his throat out where he stood. You can't, Michelle said firmly, though her heart ached at the torment she saw in Derek's face. She placed her hand over his where it still cradled her cheek. We agreed. The threats against you, the challenges to your throne, we can't give your enemies ammunition. If they know you married a human, a nobody with no pack, no power. You are not a nobody, Derek interrupted, his voice dropping to that alpha rumble that made her bones vibrate. You're my mate. My queen. And the only reason you're not standing at my side right now, wearing your crown, is because I failed to protect you from the vipers in my own court. It was an old argument, one they'd had countless times over the 8 months since their secret wedding. Derek wanted to announce their bond to the world, consequences be damned. Michelle, who'd learned the hard way what happened when she trusted the supernatural world to accept her, had begged for time. Time to prove herself worthy. Time for him to secure his position. Time for the threats circling his throne, from rival packs, from ambitious alphas, from those who believed only a wolf-blooded queen should stand beside him, to quiet. She'd thought she was being reasonable. Practical. Safe. Looking at the rage and helplessness warring in her husband's eyes, she wondered if she'd been a coward instead. 2 more days, she whispered. The summit ends in 2 days, and then I'll go back to Ashbourne, and you'll return to the capital, and I'll sleep in a bed that feels empty without you, Derek finished, his thumb tracing the curve of her jaw. I'll wake up reaching for you and find nothing. I'll attend council meetings where they parade eligible she-wolves in front of me, trying to secure political alliances through marriage, while my actual wife hides in a servant's quarters, bleeding from wounds inflicted by a man who should be groveling for the privilege of breathing the same air as you. Before Michelle could respond, footsteps echoed down the corridor, sharp, purposeful, accompanied by voices. They sprang apart, and Derek's expression shuddered into the cold, regal mask he wore in public. The warm, vulnerable man disappeared behind the Alpha King's impenetrable walls. A group of dignitaries rounded the corner, wolves from the Eastern Coalition, led by Alpha Charles Blackthorne, one of Derek's most vocal critics. His calculating eyes swept over them, taking in Michelle's servant uniform, the blood on her hands, Derek's proximity to someone so clearly beneath his station. "Your Majesty," Charles said smoothly, his tone respectful but edged with something sharp. "We were looking for you. The evening's discussions are about to begin, and your presence is anticipated." His gaze flicked to Michelle dismissively. "Though I see you've been detained by servant matters. How very hands-on of you." The insult was subtle but unmistakable. Derek's silence stretched just long enough to make Charles shift uncomfortably. When he finally spoke, his voice was Arctic ice. "I go where I please, Alpha Blackthorn. Question my movements again, and you'll find yourself discussing politics from outside the summit grounds." Charles's jaw tightened, but he bowed. "Of course, Your Majesty. My apologies. See that the servant quarters have a proper healer," Derek continued, still not looking at Michelle, though she felt the weight of his concern like a physical touch. "I won't have it said that the Ironclaw Pack mistreats its staff during my summit." "As you wish," Charles replied, though his expression suggested he found the Alpha King's concern for a mere servant both puzzling and beneath contempt. Derek walked away without a backward glance, his posture rigid, every inch the powerful, untouchable king who ruled the Northern Territories with absolute authority. Michelle watched him go, her heart clenching. This was the price of their secret. These stolen moments in corridors, these carefully maintained distances, these lies of omission that tasted like ash on her tongue. "You," Charles said, and Michelle realized with a start that he was addressing her. His eyes had sharpened with interest, studying her with the kind of attention that made her skin crawl. "What's your name, girl?" "Michelle, sir," she answered quietly, keeping her gaze lowered. The submissive posture of someone who knew her place. "Michelle," he repeated, tasting the name. "And you serve the Ironclaw Pack regularly?" "No, sir. I was hired temporarily for the summit." Something flickered in his expression, calculation, perhaps, or suspicion. The Alpha King seemed unusually concerned about a temporary servant's welfare. "Is there something I should know about your relationship with His Majesty?" Terror spiked through Michelle's chest. This was exactly what Derek had warned her about. His enemies were always watching, always looking for weaknesses to exploit, leverage to gain. If Charles even suspected. "The king is known for his fairness to all, regardless of station," she said carefully, the answer rehearsed, practiced. "I'm nobody, sir. Just a human trying to earn honest wages." A human, Charles mused, and something predatory entered his smile. "How interesting. You know, there are those in our world who believe humans have no place in wolf society. That they weaken our bloodlines, dilute our power." He stepped closer, crowding her space. "What do you think about that, Michelle?" She thought about the baby she'd lost, half human, half wolf, wanted by no one except the mother who'd loved it desperately. She thought about the cruelty she'd endured for the crime of being born without supernatural power. She thought about Derek's fierce insistence that she was worthy, valuable, deserving, even when she couldn't believe it herself. "I think," Michelle said quietly, "that worth isn't determined by what we're born as, but by what we choose to become." Charles's eyebrows rose. "Philosophical for a servant. Tell me." A commotion erupted from the grand hall, raised voices, the crash of furniture, the unmistakable snarl of wolves on the edge of violence. And cutting through it all, Stephen Thornridge's voice, loud and furious, "I don't care what the treaty says, Silvercrest. That human slut had the audacity to serve in my presence, to pollute this summit with her disgrace. I demand she be removed immediately, or I'll remove her myself, permanently this time." Michelle's blood turned to ice. Charles's smile turned razor-sharp. And from the grand hall, a sound emerged that made every wolf in the corridor freeze, the low, deadly growl of an Alpha King whose patience had just shattered. The return to the grand hall felt like walking toward an execution. Michelle's execution, specifically. Charles gripped her arm, not gently, and steered her back through the ornate doors, his fingers digging into her flesh hard enough to bruise. "Let's see what this is about, shall we?" he murmured, and there was something gleeful in his tone that made her stomach turn. The scene that greeted them was chaos barely contained. Stephen stood in the center of the hall, his face flushed with rage and alcohol, gesturing wildly as he addressed the assembled dignitaries. Sandra clung to his arm, her expression a perfect mask of wounded dignity. Around them, wolves had risen from their seats, some looking scandalized, others entertained, all riveted by the spectacle. And on the raised platform, Derek sat perfectly still on his throne, his silver eyes fixed on Stephen with the kind of attention a predator gave prey right before the kill. "Came here with false credentials," Stephen was saying, his words slightly slurred. "Pretended to be a respectable servant when everyone knows what she really is. A pack-less human who tried to trap me with a bastard pregnancy 3 years ago. She's a liar, a manipulator, probably a thief too. That's enough." Derek's voice wasn't loud, but it cut through Stephen's tirade like a blade through silk. The temperature in the hall seemed to drop 10 degrees. Stephen turned to face the Alpha King, and Michelle saw the exact moment his bravado faltered. Even drunk and furious, he wasn't stupid enough to miss the danger radiating from the most powerful Alpha in the Northern Territories. But he was arrogant enough to push forward anyway. "Your Majesty," Stephen said, bowing with exaggerated deference that bordered on mockery. "I apologize for the disturbance, but surely you understand. This human has a history of deception. She doesn't belong in civilized wolf society. For the integrity of this summit, she should be expelled immediately. You presume to tell me how to run my summit?" Derek's tone was conversational, almost pleasant. Which made it infinitely more terrifying. Michelle knew that tone. Had heard it exactly once before, when a merchant in Ashbourne had tried to cheat her and Derek had happened to be there, disguised in common clothes for one of their secret meetings. The merchant had apologized profusely and refunded triple the amount. This wouldn't end with an apology. Stephen seemed to realize he'd overstepped. "Of course not, Your Majesty. I merely meant. What happened to the child?" Derek interrupted, his gaze shifting to Michelle for the first time since she'd entered the hall. His expression was unreadable, but she saw the muscle ticking in his jaw. "The bastard pregnancy you mentioned. What became of it?" The question hung in the air like a blade. Stephen shrugged, uncomfortable now. "How should I know? I sent her away. Whatever happened after that is hardly my concern. The child probably didn't survive. Half-human whelps rarely do, especially when the mother is weak and..." "Didn't survive," Derek repeated softly. "Because you threw a pregnant woman into the wilderness with nothing. No pack. No protection. No resources. She wasn't my responsibility," Stephen shot back, defensive now. "She knew what she was getting into when she spread her legs for." The growl that erupted from Derek's chest made every wolf in the hall drop their eyes in automatic submission. Even Stephen stumbled back a step, his face going pale. "Careful," Derek said, rising from his throne with predatory grace. "Very, very careful what you say next, Beta Thornridge." Michelle wanted to run. Wanted to disappear. Wanted to be anywhere but here, watching her past and present collide in the most catastrophic way possible. Charles's grip on her arm tightened. "Fascinating," he murmured. "The Alpha King seems remarkably invested in defending a nobody servant. One might wonder why." Around them, other wolves had begun to notice the same thing. Whispers rippled through the crowd. Speculation. Suspicion. This was spiraling out of control. "Your Majesty," Michelle heard herself say, her voice steady despite the terror clawing at her throat. "Please. I'm not worth this disruption. I'll leave. I'll go quietly. There's no need for..." You'll stay exactly where you are, Derek commanded, and the alpha authority in his voice made her freeze instinctively. He descended from the platform, moving with lethal purpose toward Stephen. This man assaulted you. Humiliated you. Made accusations against your character. I want to hear your side. My side doesn't matter, Michelle whispered. It matters to me. 3 words. Simple. Devastating. The hall had gone utterly silent. Every eye was fixed on them now, on the Alpha King defending a human servant with an intensity that suggested something far deeper than casual concern. Stephen's wife, Sandra, had gone very still, her sharp eyes darting between Derek and Michelle. Your Majesty, she said carefully, surely a woman of her background isn't worth your personal attention. My husband may have been harsh, but he's not entirely wrong. She did try to trap him with a pregnancy. She did lie about their relationship. These are facts. Facts, Derek echoed. Very well. Let's discuss facts. He turned to Stephen. Did you or did you not have a relationship with this woman 3 years ago? Stephen's jaw worked. A brief indiscretion. Nothing serious. And when she became pregnant with your child? I ended it. As was my right. By throwing her out of your territory. While she was pregnant. Knowing she had nowhere to go. She should have been more careful, Stephen snapped, some of his courage returning now that Derek hadn't immediately attacked him. She knew I couldn't acknowledge a half-breed child. My bloodline is pure for 7 generations. I had responsibilities to my pack, my family name. Your responsibilities, Derek said, included the child you helped create. Instead, you sentenced both mother and baby to likely death. And now you dare to assault this woman again, 3 years later, because seeing her reminds you of your own cowardice. The accusation, spoken by the Alpha King in front of the most powerful wolves in the territory, hit Stephen like a physical blow. His face flushed dark red. Your Majesty, you don't understand the situation. I understand perfectly. Derek's voice had gone soft again. Dangerous. I understand that you're a coward who preys on the vulnerable. I understand that you lack honor, compassion, and basic decency. What I don't understand is why I'm allowing you to continue breathing. Michelle's heart hammered against her ribs. This had gone too far. Derek was going to reveal their bond, consequences be damned, and she couldn't let that happen. Not when she'd seen the intelligence network reports he thought he'd hidden from her. Not when she knew there were at least 3 assassination plots circulating against him, all centered around the weakness of his unmarried status and the political vulnerability it created. She pulled free from Charles's grip and stepped forward. Stop. Michelle's voice rang out across the hall, quieter than the others but somehow cutting through the tension like a bell. Every head turned toward her. She felt the weight of their stares, judgmental, curious, dismissive, but she kept her eyes locked on Derek. On her husband, who looked at her with barely controlled fury and something that looked dangerously close to desperation. Your Majesty, she said formally, each word carefully measured. I appreciate your concern. But Beta Thornridge is right about one thing. I don't belong here. I'm just a human who made poor choices and paid the price for them. Whatever happened between us, she gestured vaguely at Stephen, is ancient history. Not worth disrupting this important summit over. Michelle, Derek's voice held a warning. I'll pack my things and leave within the hour, she continued, as if he hadn't spoken. Please, accept my apologies for the disturbance. She bowed, to Derek, to the assembled dignitaries, and turned to leave. She made it exactly 3 steps before Derek's hand closed around her wrist. The touch sent electricity racing up her arm, and she saw several wolves notice the way she reacted, the sharp intake of breath, the slight tremble, the flush that crept up her neck. Physical responses she couldn't control when he touched her, even here, even now. You're not going anywhere, Derek said quietly, his thumb brushing over the ring she wore, his ring, the one she turned inward again to hide its significance. Your Majesty, please. Do you know what this is? Derek addressed the hall suddenly, his voice carrying to every corner. He lifted her hand, turning it so the ring caught the light. The silver band began to glow softly, responding to his proximity, his touch, the bond that connected them. No. No, no, no. Derek, don't, Michelle whispered desperately, using his name without his title for the first time in public, panic-overwhelming protocol. But he wasn't listening anymore. 8 months of hiding, of pretending, of watching her suffer in silence while he sat on his throne and played political games, something in him had finally snapped. This, Derek continued, his silver eyes blazing, is a royal bonding ring. There are only 7 in existence, passed down through the Silvercrest bloodline for over 1,000 years. They cannot be stolen. They cannot be forged. They can only be given by an alpha king to his chosen mate, and they can only be activated by true bond magic. The hall erupted in shocked murmurs. Stephen's face had gone white. That's impossible. She's human. She can't be queen. Derek finished, his voice dropping to a growl. She can't be worthy of an alpha king's bond. That's what you were going to say, wasn't it, Thornridge? Your Majesty, surely this is some kind of mistake, Charles interjected, stepping forward with carefully constructed concern. This woman is packless, powerless. She has no bloodline, no connections, no. She has me, Derek interrupted, pulling Michelle closer until she stood at his side, his arm wrapping around her waist with possessive certainty. She has been my lawfully wedded mate for 8 months. She carries my mark, my ring, and my protection. And the man who kicked her, who dared to lay hands on my queen, is going to learn exactly what happens when you assault the Luna of the Northern Territories. The silence that followed was absolute. Michelle felt the world tilt beneath her feet. This was everything they'd agreed not to do. Every careful plan, every protective measure, every reason they'd kept their marriage secret, all of it crumbling in real time. But looking up at Derek's face, seeing the fierce pride there, the absolute refusal to hide her anymore, she felt something crack open in her chest. Something that had been locked tight since the day Stephen threw her away like garbage. Maybe she was tired of hiding too. Stephen made a choking sound. You married her. But she's nothing. She's broken, used, weak. She survived what you did to her, Derek said softly, and there was something lethal in his tone now. She survived losing her child alone in the wilderness. She survived starvation, exposure, and a cruelty that would have broken stronger wolves than you'll ever be. And when I found her, half dead and still fighting to live, I saw what you were too blind and arrogant to see. I saw strength. I saw courage. I saw a woman worth loving, worth protecting, worth standing beside. Tears burned in Michelle's eyes. He'd never said it quite like this before, never laid it out so plainly, so publicly. She's human, Sandra spat, her composure finally cracking. She can't give you an heir. She can't strengthen your bloodline. This is madness, Your Majesty. The Council will never accept. The Council serves at my pleasure, Derek said coldly. Not the other way around. And if they have issues with my choice of mate, they're welcome to challenge me for my throne. I assure you, I'll enjoy the exercise. No one moved. No one was foolish enough to accept that invitation. Charles, however, wasn't done. Your Majesty, while we all respect your authority, surely you can see how this revelation creates complications. There are those who will view a human queen as a sign of weakness. Who will question your judgment? Who will plot against me? Derek finished. Oh, I'm counting on it, Blackthorn. Because my enemies have a habit of revealing themselves when they think they've found leverage. And when they do, I'll deal with them as I deal with all threats to my throne and my mate. His eyes swept the hall, and Michelle felt the pulse of pure alpha dominance that rolled off him. Let me be absolutely clear. This woman is my bonded mate. My wife. Your queen. Anyone who harms her, threatens her, or shows her anything less than the respect she deserves will answer to me personally. Am I understood? A chorus of, "Yes, Your Majesty," rippled through the crowd. But Michelle saw the calculation in Charles's eyes, the fury in Stephen's face, the shock and speculation in dozens of others. Derek had just painted a target on both their backs. And from the grim set of his jaw, he knew it. Now, Derek continued, turning his attention back to Stephen with predatory focus, let's discuss your punishment for assaulting the Queen of the Northern Territories. Stephen stumbled backward, terror finally breaking through his arrogance. Your Majesty, I didn't know. If I had known. If you had known, you wouldn't have kicked her. Derek's smile was razor-sharp. So your abuse is acceptable as long as the victim is powerless enough. How very enlightening. The punishment Derek decreed was swift and absolute. Stephen Thornridge was stripped of his beta title, his family's lands reduced by half, and he was banned from all royal territories for 10 years. Sandra, complicit in the assault through her mockery and encouragement, faced social exile from court functions. The Thornridge name, once respected, would carry the stain of having attacked the Queen. It should have felt like justice. Instead, as Michelle stood beside Derek while he pronounced sentence, watching Stephen's face contort with rage and humiliation, she felt only a creeping sense of dread. Because she knew men like Stephen. Knew how they thought, how they plotted, how they blamed everyone but themselves for their downfall. And she'd just become the reason for his complete destruction. The summit dissolved into barely controlled chaos after Derek's announcement. Some alphas congratulated him, carefully, politically, their eyes assessing Michelle like a problem to be solved. Others withdrew into private conversations, their expressions grave. Charles Blackthorne smiled and bowed and said all the right things, but his eyes promised that this wasn't over. Not even close. Derek moved her to the royal suite immediately, assigning 6 guards to her door. No one gets in without my permission, he'd ordered, his hand cupping her face with desperate gentleness. I need to deal with the political fallout, manage the alphas who are already demanding audiences. Will you be all right here? Michelle had nodded, not trusting her voice. Now, alone in rooms decorated with more luxury than she'd seen in her entire life, she stood at the window overlooking the Ironclaw Pack's grounds and tried to breathe through the panic constricting her chest. Everything had changed. Everything. The careful anonymity that had protected her was gone. The quiet life she'd built in Ashbourne, the bakery job, the tiny room, the simple existence where no one looked at her twice, was impossible now. She was the Alpha King's human wife. The queen who couldn't shift, couldn't fight, couldn't defend herself against the enemies that would come. And they would come. A soft knock at the door made her spin around. Your Majesty. A female voice, hesitant. I'm Jessica, your assigned attendant. I've brought dinner and fresh clothes. Michelle opened the door to find a young she-wolf holding a tray, her expression carefully neutral. But Michelle caught the flash of curiosity, the assessment in her eyes as she took in the human who'd somehow captured an Alpha King. Thank you, Michelle said quietly, stepping aside to let her enter. Jessica set the tray on an ornate table, then turned with a formal curtsy that felt more mocking than respectful. Will there be anything else, Your Majesty? The title sounded wrong in her mouth. Like a joke. No, that's all. Jessica left, but not before Michelle caught her whispered conversation with the guards outside. Can you believe it? A human. The council is going to lose their minds. I give it 3 months before someone challenges him or she mysteriously disappears. The door closed on her quiet laughter. Michelle sank into a chair, her hands trembling. This was what she'd feared. What she'd begged Derek to avoid by keeping their marriage secret. The contempt. The disbelief. The certainty that she was a liability, a weakness, a mistake that needed correcting. Hours passed. Derek didn't return. Night fell over the Ironclaw territory, and Michelle found herself pacing the suite, her mind spinning with worst-case scenarios. What if the Alphas were demanding he renounce their marriage? What if Charles was building a coalition against him? What if exposing their bond had given his enemies exactly the leverage they needed? A sound at the window made her freeze. The glass exploded inward in a shower of shards. Michelle screamed, throwing her arms up to protect her face as a figure crashed through, landing in a crouch on the carpet. Male. Wolf. Eyes gleaming with malice and something that looked like madness. Stephen. Did you think, he snarled, rising to his full height, that I would let you destroy me without consequences? Did you think I'd just accept losing everything because you spread your legs for someone more powerful? Terror locked Michelle's muscles. The guards, where were the guards? They're unconscious, Stephen said, reading her expression. Drugged. It's amazing what you can accomplish when you have allies who hate the Alpha King as much as you do. He stalked toward her, and she saw the silver glint of a blade in his hand. You've taken everything from me, Michelle. My title, my lands, my reputation. You've made me a laughingstock. You did that yourself, Michelle managed, backing away until she hit the wall. When you threw me out. When you let our baby die. When you kicked me tonight. That bastard was never going to live anyway, Stephen spat. Weak. Half-breed. Better off dead, just like its whore mother should have been. The blade flashed toward her. Michelle dodged, pure survival instinct overriding her fear. The knife sliced through her borrowed dress, drawing blood across her ribs, the same ribs Stephen had kicked earlier. Pain exploded through her side, but she kept moving, scrambling for the door. Stephen caught her hair, yanking her back with brutal force. You're not going anywhere. When they find you dead, everyone will know what happens to humans who try to rise above their station. They'll know that not even an Alpha King can protect something as worthless as you. Derek will kill you, Michelle gasped, clawing at his grip. Maybe, Stephen agreed, bringing the knife to her throat. But you'll still be dead. And he'll be broken. And that's enough. The blade pressed against her skin, sharp enough to draw blood. Michelle closed her eyes, thinking of Derek. Of the life they'd planned. Of the future that was ending before it really began. But then, a sound. A roar that shook the very foundations of the building. The door exploded inward. And Derek stood there, his eyes pure silver fire, his alpha power rolling off him in waves so intense that Stephen actually stumbled backward, the knife falling from his suddenly nerveless fingers. Get, Derek said, his voice barely human, away from my mate. What happened next would be talked about in wolf packs for generations. Derek moved with a speed that defied physics, crossing the room in a blur of motion that ended with his hand wrapped around Stephen's throat, lifting him off the ground like he weighed nothing. The alpha power radiating from him was so intense that the very air seemed to shimmer, and Michelle felt the pressure of it against her skin like a physical force. You dare, Derek growled, and his voice was layered with the beast beneath, his wolf pushing so close to the surface that his bones crackled with the beginning of a shift. You dare enter my territory, drug my guards, and put your filthy hands on what is mine. Stephen choked, his face purpling, his feet kicking uselessly as Derek's grip tightened. Derek, Michelle gasped, pressing her hand to the bleeding cut on her throat. Don't kill him. Please. Silver eyes swung toward her, and for a moment she saw something feral there, something that didn't recognize mercy or restraint. But then he focused on her face, on the blood trickling down her neck, on the terror she couldn't quite hide, and she saw the man she loved fight his way back to the surface. "He tried to kill you," Derek said, his voice shaking with the effort of control. "I know. But if you kill him now, like this, his allies will use it against you. They'll say you murdered him in blind rage. That you can't control yourself. That a human mate makes you weak and irrational. I don't care what they say. I do." Michelle stepped closer, her hand touching his arm gently. "I care because I won't be the reason you lose everything you've built. Please, Derek. There are other ways to deal with this." For a long moment, Derek didn't move. Then, with visible effort, he threw Stephen across the room. The beta hit the wall hard enough to crack the plaster, sliding down to the floor in a groaning heap. "Chain him," Derek ordered the guards who had rushed in behind him, different guards, ones he must have brought himself when he realized something was wrong. "Silver chains. And find out who helped him. I want names, confessions, everything." The guards moved to obey, hauling Stephen to his feet and binding him with chains that burned against wolf skin, preventing any possibility of shifting or using supernatural strength. Stephen lifted his head, blood dripping from his mouth, hatred burning in his eyes. "This isn't over, Silvercrest. Your precious human has made you soft. Weak. The other alphas see it. They're already talking about how unfit you are to rule. A king who can be controlled by a powerless woman's tears." Derek backhanded him so hard Stephen's head snapped to the side. "Take him to the cells," Derek said coldly. "And if he speaks again without permission, cut out his tongue." As the guards dragged Stephen away, his laughter echoed down the corridor, broken, unhinged, promising that this was far from finished. The moment they were gone, Derek turned to Michelle, his hands cupping her face with desperate gentleness. Let me see where he hurt you." "I'm fine," Michelle started to say, but Derek was already examining the cut on her throat, his jaw clenching at the sight. "He could have killed you. If I'd been 1 minute later. But you weren't." Michelle covered his hands with hers. "How did you know?" "I felt it." Derek's voice roughened. "The bond. You were terrified, in pain, and I felt it like a knife to my chest. I was in a meeting with the Eastern Coalition, listening to Charles drone on about political alliances, and suddenly I couldn't breathe. I knew you needed me. The bond. The invisible thread that connected them, that she'd felt from the moment Derek had saved her life 3 years ago, had grown stronger with their marriage. She'd read about mate bonds, how they allowed wolves to sense each other's emotions, their pain, their need. She hadn't realized it would work with a human mate too. "Stephen was right about one thing," Derek said quietly, pulling her into his arms, careful of her injuries. "I am weak when it comes to you. I would burn the entire world down to keep you safe." "That's not weakness," Michelle whispered against his chest. "That's love. The alphas don't see it that way. While you were up here fighting for your life, I was downstairs fighting a different battle. Charles has convinced half the coalition that our marriage is a political disaster. They're demanding I renounce our bond, take up proper, queen, or face a vote of no confidence." Michelle's blood ran cold. A vote of no confidence means they can challenge my right to rule. Force me into combat trials against other alphas who think they do a better job. It's legal under the old laws, and Charles knows exactly how to manipulate those laws to his advantage. "Then give them what they want," Michelle said, the words tearing out of her even as they broke her heart. "Renounce the bond. Tell them it was a mistake. I'll leave, go somewhere far away where they can't use me against you." "Stop." Derek's arms tightened around her. "Do you really think I would do that? After everything? After finally having the courage to claim you publicly? I think you have a kingdom to protect. Thousands of wolves who depend on you. And I think I'm not worth losing all of that." Derek pulled back just enough to look into her eyes. You're worth everything, he said fiercely. But you're also right that I have responsibilities I can't ignore. Which is why we're not running. We're not hiding. We're going to fight. How? I'm human. I can't help you in combat trials. I can't use political influence I don't have. I can't. You can stand beside me, Derek interrupted. And show every wolf in this territory that you're not the weakness they think you are. That you're my strength. A knock at the door interrupted them. One of Derek's personal guards entered, his expression grim. Your Majesty, you need to see this. He handed Derek a document, an official petition signed by 23 alphas, including Charles Blackthorne. Michelle watched Derek's face as he read it, watched the muscle in his jaw tick, watched fury and something that looked like grim satisfaction war in his expression. What is it? She asked quietly. Derek looked up, and his smile was sharp enough to cut. They've invoked the trial of queens. 3 challenges to prove that my chosen mate is worthy of standing beside me. Combat, strategy, and leadership. But I can't fight. I can't. The first trial is tomorrow at dawn, Derek continued, his eyes blazing. And if you fail even one challenge, our bond will be declared invalid, and I'll be forced to choose a new queen from their approved candidates. Dawn came too quickly. Michelle stood in the center of the Ironclaw Pack ceremonial grounds, surrounded by hundreds of wolves who'd gathered to watch her fail. The air was thick with anticipation and barely concealed contempt. She could hear the whispers, feel the weight of their judgment pressing down on her shoulders. A human attempting the trial of queens. It was unheard of. Impossible. Exactly what Charles and his allies were counting on. Derek stood on the raised platform with the other alphas, his expression carved from stone. They'd had only hours to prepare, hours for him to explain the trials and for Michelle to accept that her worthiness, and their future, would be decided today. The first trial, Charles announced, his voice carrying across the grounds, is combat. The challenger must face 3 opponents of increasing difficulty and prove she can defend herself and, by extension, defend the king and his territories. A she-wolf stepped into the circle, young, strong, her eyes gleaming with confidence. This was Kara, a warrior from Charles's own pack. The odds were designed to be insurmountable. Michelle had never won a fight in her life. But as she looked at Derek, saw the faith burning in his silver eyes despite everything, she remembered something he'd told her during those long nights in Ashbourne when he'd visit her in secret. Strength isn't just physical power. It's knowing your advantages and using them. Michelle couldn't match a wolf's supernatural strength. But she'd survived 3 years of hell through cunning, resilience, and the ability to read people. She could use that. The fight began with Kara's confident lunge. Michelle didn't try to meet her head-on. Instead, she dropped low and rolled, using the she-wolf's momentum against her. Kara stumbled, surprised, and Michelle was already moving, grabbing a handful of dirt and throwing it in her opponent's eyes. The crowd gasped. It wasn't honorable. It wasn't how wolves fought. But the rules said nothing about fighting fair. Kara snarled, blinded and furious, swinging wildly. Michelle stayed just out of reach, letting the she-wolf tire herself out, watching for patterns in her movements. When Kara finally lunged again, overextended and frustrated, Michelle sidestepped and used the wrestling move Derek had taught her, hooking her leg, using leverage to send the stronger opponent crashing to the ground. Kara's head hit hard. She didn't get up. Stunned silence, then murmurs of disbelief rippled through the crowd. The second opponent was larger, more experienced. A male warrior who looked at Michelle like she was already dead. This time, Michelle used the weapons provided, wooden staffs meant to simulate real combat. She'd never trained formally, but she'd watched Derek spar, had absorbed his lessons even when he thought she wasn't paying attention. She lost ground quickly. The warrior was too strong, too skilled. But Michelle noticed something: he favored his left side, protecting old injuries. She targeted his right, forcing him to overcompensate, making him sloppy. When he finally made a mistake, she swept his legs and brought the staff to his throat. "Yield," she gasped. He stared at her in shock, then tapped the ground twice. "Surrender." The third opponent made Michelle's heart sink. It was a female alpha, battle-scarred and deadly, who'd agreed to participate in exchange for political favors from Charles. This was meant to be impossible. They circled each other, and Michelle knew she couldn't win through tactics alone. This woman was too experienced, too powerful. So Michelle did something desperate. She spoke. "Do you have a mate?" Michelle asked quietly. The alpha's eyes narrowed. "What does that have to do with anything?" "I'm just wondering if they know you're doing Charles's dirty work. Trying to destroy a bond because he's threatened by what it represents." "I'm here because humans don't belong as queens," the alpha growled. "No, you're here because Charles promised you something. Territory? Trade rights? What did he offer to make you complicit in breaking a sacred mate bond?" The alpha hesitated, and Michelle saw it, a flicker of doubt, of discomfort. "The bond between mates is supposed to be sacred," Michelle continued, lowering her staff slightly. "What happens when the precedent is set that political convenience matters more than that bond? How long before someone decides your mate isn't politically advantageous either?" "That's different." "Is it?" Michelle met her eyes. "Today it's the human queen. Tomorrow it's the alpha whose pack is too small, or whose bloodline isn't pure enough, or whose political alliance has shifted. If we allow bonds to be broken for politics, none of us are safe." The alpha stood still for a long moment. Then, incredibly, she dropped her weapon. "I yield," she said quietly. "Not because you beat me in combat. But because you're right. And because any woman who can survive what you've survived and still stand here, still fight, deserves respect." The crowd erupted in chaos. Charles shot to his feet, fury contorting his features. "That's not how the trial works. She has to win through combat, not manipulation." "She won through wisdom," another alpha interrupted, Mira Shadowpine, one of the few who'd remained neutral. "The trial says she must prove she can defend the king and his territories." She did. She identified the real threat, your political maneuvering, and neutralized it. The second trial was strategy, a complex scenario involving territorial disputes and resource allocation. Michelle drew on every lesson she'd learned surviving as a pack-less human, every negotiation she'd navigated, every time she'd had to think 3 steps ahead just to stay alive. She didn't just pass. She excelled, presenting solutions that impressed even Charles's allies. The final trial was leadership. Michelle had to address the assembled wolves and convince them she deserved to be their queen. She stood before hundreds of powerful supernatural beings, a human woman with no pack, no power, nothing but her voice and her truth. "I can't shift," she began quietly. "I can't match your strength, your speed, your supernatural abilities. I'm human, and that will never change. Some of you see that as weakness." She paused, meeting eyes throughout the crowd. "But I've learned something about strength. Real strength isn't just physical power. It's surviving when everything is taken from you. It's choosing kindness when cruelty is easier. It's standing back up every time you're knocked down. I've been abandoned, abused, left for dead. I lost a child because someone decided I wasn't worth basic compassion." Her voice strengthened. "And I'm still here. Still standing. Still fighting. Not because I'm superhuman, but because I refuse to let cruelty win. If that's not the kind of strength you want in a queen, then you're right, I don't belong here. But if you believe that leadership means protecting the vulnerable, standing up for what's right even when it's hard, and never giving up no matter the odds, then maybe a human who's lived through hell and came out stronger is exactly the queen you need." Silence fell. Then, from the back, someone began to clap. More joined. Then more. Not everyone. But enough. The verdict came 3 hours later, after intense deliberation among the alphas. Michelle stood before the council, Derek at her side, his hand wrapped firmly around hers. She could feel the tension radiating from him, the barely contained fury at having to watch his mate prove herself to wolves who should have accepted her the moment he claimed her. But she could also feel something else, his pride. His absolute, unwavering faith in her. Charles stood to deliver the decision, his expression sour. The trial of queens has concluded. The challenger has passed all 3 tests: combat, strategy, and leadership. By the ancient laws, Michelle Silvercrest is recognized as the lawful mate and queen of Alpha King Derek Silvercrest. The words tasted like poison in his mouth, but they were binding. Relief crashed through Michelle so intensely her knees nearly buckled. Derek's arm immediately wrapped around her waist, steadying her, his lips brushing her temple in a gesture of such tender affection that several wolves looked away, uncomfortable with the raw emotion on display. However, Charles continued, and Michelle's relief crystallized into ice. There remains the matter of Beta Stephen Thornridge and his co-conspirators. 6 wolves were led into the hall in silver chains: Stephen, 2 of Charles's guards who'd helped drug Derek's men, and 3 others who'd provided assistance or information. They looked broken, terrified, realizing too late that their plot had failed catastrophically. Derek's expression hardened. "Stephen Thornridge, you are charged with attempted murder of the Queen, conspiracy, assault, and breaking pack law. The sentence is death." Stephen's face went white. "No. No, please, Your Majesty, I was angry, I wasn't thinking clearly. The human, the Queen, she ruined my life." "You ruined your own life," Derek said coldly. "The moment you threw a pregnant woman into the wilderness. The moment you let your child die through your cruelty. The moment you put your hands on my mate. You made your choices, Thornridge. Now face the consequences." "Wait." Michelle's voice cut through the tension. Everyone turned to stare at her, including Derek, whose eyebrows rose in surprise. "Michelle," he said quietly, "he tried to kill you. Twice." "I know." She stepped forward, studying Stephen, the man who'd once promised to love her, who'd destroyed her so completely she'd wanted to die. He looked pathetic now, his arrogance stripped away, leaving only cowardice and desperation. She should want him dead. Part of her did. But a larger part remembered the girl she'd been 3 years ago, begging for mercy that never came. Remembered the emptiness of revenge, how it could never fill the holes loss left behind. "I want him to live," Michelle said quietly. The hall erupted in protests. Even Derek looked stunned. "Live?" Charles demanded. "Your Majesty, surely you cannot be serious. This man," Michelle interrupted, her voice carrying with unexpected authority, "will live with the knowledge that the woman he tried to destroy is now a queen. That the worthless human he threw away proved herself to hundreds of wolves while he groveled in chains. Death would be mercy. I want him to live with his failure." She turned to Stephen, who stared at her with incomprehension. "You'll be stripped of all titles and lands," Michelle continued. "Exiled from every pack territory in the northern kingdoms. You'll live as I lived, packless, powerless, surviving on scraps and charity. And every day, you'll remember that you had something precious and you threw it away. You'll remember that you could have been a father, a partner, someone worthy of love. Instead, you chose cruelty. Let that be your punishment." Stephen's face crumpled. "Please," he whispered. "Just kill me. Don't make me live with what you've done." Michelle finished. "That's exactly what I'm making you do." She looked at Derek, who studied her face with an expression that held awe, love, and something that looked like profound respect. "Your Majesty," she said softly. "I know it's your decision ultimately. But this is what I'm asking for." Derek was silent for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly. "It will be as my queen wishes. Stephen Thornridge, you are hereby exiled. If you set foot in any territory under my jurisdiction, the death sentence will be carried out immediately. Take him away." As the guards dragged Stephen out, his sobs echoing through the hall, Michelle felt something inside her finally settle. The ghost of the girl she'd been, the one who'd begged and been denied mercy, could finally rest. She had survived. She had won. Not through becoming cruel like those who'd hurt her, but by choosing a different path. The next weeks transformed Michelle's life in ways she'd never imagined. Derek moved her permanently to the royal palace, where they no longer had to hide their bond, their love, their partnership. She began learning the intricate politics of ruling, discovering she had a natural talent for diplomacy and strategy. Some wolves never accepted her. They whispered behind her back, questioned her worthiness, made her work twice as hard for half the respect. But others, like Mira Shadowpine, like the female alpha who'd yielded during the trials, like dozens of young wolves who saw in Michelle's story a message that worth wasn't determined by birth, became her strongest allies. 6 months after the trials, Michelle stood on the palace balcony, watching the sun set over the northern territories. Derek came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist, his chin resting on her shoulder. "Regrets?" he murmured. "About marrying the most powerful, stubborn, overprotective alpha in existence?" Michelle smiled. "Every day." He laughed, the sound warm and genuine. "Liar." "Maybe," she admitted, turning in his arms to face him. "But I do think about how different things could have been. If Stephen had chosen differently. If I'd never been thrown out. If you'd never found me in that forest. I would have found you eventually," Derek said with absolute certainty. "Fate doesn't make mistakes, love. You were always meant to be mine. Just as I was always meant to be yours." Michelle looked into his silver eyes, this man who'd saved her, loved her, fought beside her, and felt the truth of it resonate through her bones. She'd been broken, abandoned, left for dead. But she'd survived. She'd risen. She'd become something neither she nor anyone else had believed possible. A queen. A Luna. A woman who'd proven that strength came in many forms, and that love, real, genuine, hard-won love, was worth fighting for. "I love you," she whispered. "I love you too," Derek replied. "My queen. My mate. My everything." And as the sun set over their kingdom, Michelle finally allowed herself to believe in happy endings. Not because life would suddenly become easy, it wouldn't. Not because all their enemies had disappeared, they hadn't. But because she'd learned the most important lesson of all, she was strong enough to face whatever came next. Together, they were unstoppable. And that was enough. And there we have it, beautiful souls. A story of survival, redemption, and love conquering all odds. Thank you so much for reading this journey with me. If you enjoyed this emotional roller coaster, please hit that like button, subscribe if you haven't already, and drop a comment telling me what you thought. Should Stephen have faced a harsher punishment? Do you believe in second chances? Let me know. Until next time.